All right, good afternoon, everybody. 7 years ago, in April of 2009, our economy lost nearly 700,000 jobs, and the unemployment rate hit 9% on its way to 10%. 7 years later, in April 2016, our economy added 160,000 new jobs. That makes April the 74th consecutive month of private sector job growth in America. Over that record streak of job growth, our businesses have created 14.6 million new jobs in all. Wages have been rising at an annual rate of more than 3% this year. So the unemployment rate has been growing, unemployment has been falling, and wages have been rising. But the global economy, as many people here are aware, is not growing as fast as it should be. You're still seeing lagging growth in places like Europe, Japan, and now China. Here in the United States, there are folks out there who are still hurting. And so we've got to do everything we can to strengthen the good trends and to guard against some dangerous trends in the global economy. And if the Republican Congress joined us to take some steps that are pretty common sense, then we could put some additional wind at the backs of working Americans. To create new jobs, they should invest in our infrastructure, our roads, our bridges, our schools, our water mains. Some of you joined me when I went to Flint this week. It was a great example of the kind of work that is out there to be done. And we could be putting people all across this country back to work with huge multiplier effects across the economy if we started investing in the infrastructure that will make us more productive. To reward some of the hardest working people in America, Congress should raise the minimum wage. This is something that would not only help those individuals who are getting a bigger paycheck, but it also means they're spending more, and that would be a boost to business. To level the playing field for American workers and crack down on unfair foreign competition, they should pass smart new trade agreements. And Congress should reform our tax code to promote growth and job creation, which includes closing wasteful loopholes and simplifying the tax code for everybody. Now, I've been talking about this for a while. Only Congress can fully close the loopholes that wealthy individuals and powerful corporations all too often take advantage of, often at the expense of middle-class families. If they're getting out of paying their fair share of taxes, that means that the rest of us have to shoulder that burden. And I've put forward plans repeatedly to do exactly that. Close loopholes, make sure that everybody's paying their fair share, which would not only give people greater confidence in the system, but would be good for our economy. It would make sure that families and small businesses who don't have fancy lawyers and fancy accountants are being treated the same as big corporations who do. I think it's fair to say that Congress will not act on a big tax reform plan before the election that would shut down some of these loopholes. But what my administration has been doing is to look for steps that we can take on our own to make the tax system fair. In recent months, we've seen just how big a problem corruption and tax evasion have become around the globe. We saw what happened with the release of the Panama Papers, and we've seen the degree to which both legal practices of tax avoidance that are still unfair and bad for the economy, as well as illegal practices that in some cases involve nefarious activities, continue to exist and to spread. So combating this kind of tax evasion and strengthening the global financial system have been priorities of mine since I took office, and they're part of our broader ongoing efforts to make sure that the rules aren't rigged and our economy works for everybody. Let me give you an example. Here at home, we've made our tax code fair and asked the wealthiest Americans to start paying their fair share. And last month, the Treasury Department took action to prevent more corporations from taking advantage of a tax loophole that let them shift their address abroad just to avoid paying taxes in America, taxes that they rightfully owe. We've taken several steps to make sure that our tax laws are enforced, including leading efforts to crack down on offshore evasion. And as a result, thousands of individuals have come forward to disclose offshore accounts and pay the taxes that they owe, along with interest and penalties. Today, we're building on those efforts. And I believe that you've heard from Treasury, but I want to amplify what they've told you in detail. Number one, we are requiring banks and other financial institutions to know, verify, and report who the real people are behind shell corporations that set up accounts at those institutions. One of the main ways that companies avoid taxes, or wealthy individuals avoid taxes, is by setting up a bunch of shell corporations and making it harder to trace where monies are flowing and what taxes are owed. We're saying to those financial institutions, you got to step up and get that information. Second, we're plugging a gap in our tax rules that foreigners can exploit to hide their assets to evade taxes. The Treasury Department and the IRS are issuing a proposed rule to make sure foreigners cannot hide behind anonymous shell companies formed inside the United States. Now, these actions are going to make a difference. They will allow us to continue to do a better job of tracking financial flows and making sure that people are paying the taxes that they owe, rather than using shell corporations and offshore accounts to avoid doing the things that ordinary Americans, hardworking Americans, are doing every day, and that's making sure that they're paying their fair share. Having said that, we're not going to be able to complete this job unless Congress acts as well. So I'm calling on Congress to pass new legislation that requires all companies formed inside the United States to report information about their real owners to the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. That's going to help law enforcement better investigate and prevent financial crimes. I'm calling on Congress to provide the Justice Department with additional tools to investigate corruption and money launderers. And I'm calling on the Senate, in particular Senator Rand Paul, who's been a little quirky on this issue, to stop blocking the implementation of tax treaties that have been pending for years. And these treaties actually improve law enforcement's ability to investigate and crack down on offshore tax evasion. And I'm assuming that's not something that he's in favor of. So we're going to need to cooperate internationally, because tax evasion, tax avoidance, money laundering, these things are all taking place in a global financial system, and if we can't cooperate with other countries, it makes it harder for us to crack down. If we can combine the actions that we're taking administratively with the new tools that I'm asking Congress to provide the Justice Department and Treasury, these actions will prevent tax evasion, they'll prevent money laundering, they'll prevent terrorist financing, and they'll, most importantly, uphold a fundamental principle of our economy. In America, no matter how wealthy or powerful, you should play by the same set of rules as everybody else. All right, thanks. I'm going to take a couple questions with that. Let's see. Go ahead, Jeff, since you're now the incoming president of the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, what's your reaction to Donald Trump becoming the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party this week? And given the delegate math, do you think it's time for Bernie Sanders to step aside on the Democratic race?
Well, with respect to the Republican process and Mr. Trump, there's going to be plenty of time to talk about his positions on various issues. He has a long record that needs to be examined. And I think it's important for us to take seriously the statements he's made in the past. But most importantly, and I speak to all of you in this room as reporters, as well as the American public, I just want to emphasize the degree to which we are in serious times, and this is a really serious job. This is not entertainment. This is not a reality show. This is a contest for the presidency of the United States. And what that means is that every candidate, every nominee needs to be subject to exacting standards and genuine scrutiny. It means that you got to make sure that their budgets add up. It means that if they say they've got an answer to a problem, that it is actually plausible and that they have details for how it would work. And if it's completely implausible and would not work, that needs to be reported on. And the American people need to know that. You know, if they take a position on international issues that could threaten war or has the potential of upending our critical relationships with other countries, or would potentially break the financial system, that needs to be reported on. And you know, the one thing that I'm going to really be looking for over the next 6 months is that the American people are effectively informed about where candidates stand on the issues, what they believe, making sure that their numbers add up, making sure that their policies have been vetted, and that candidates are held to what they've said in the past. And if that happens, then I'm confident our democracy will work. And that's true whether we're talking about Mr. Trump or Ms. Clinton or Bernie Sanders or anybody else. But what I'm concerned about is the degree to which reporting and information starts emphasizing the spectacle and the circus, because that's not something we can afford. And the American people, they've got good judgment, they've got good instincts, as long as they get good information. All right? I think on the Democratic side, let's let the process play itself out. You know, you mentioned the delegate math. I think everybody knows what that math is. I think Senator Sanders has done an extraordinary job raising a whole range of issues that are important to Democratic voters as well as the American people generally. And I know that at some point there's going to be a conversation between Secretary Clinton and Bernie Sanders about how we move towards the convention. The good news is that despite the fact that during the course of primaries everybody starts getting a little chippy, I've been through this, it's natural, sometimes even more with the staffs and supporters than with the candidates themselves. The good news is that there's a pretty strong consensus within the Democratic Party on the vast majority of issues. There's some disagreement about tactics, there's some disagreement about political strategy or policy nuance, but both Secretary Clinton and Bernie Sanders believe that every American should have health care. So do I. Both candidates believe that we should be raising the minimum wage. Both candidates believe that we should invest in our infrastructure and put more people back to work. Both candidates believe that we should pass a comprehensive immigration reform policy that makes sure we're enforcing laws and improving our legal immigration system and making sure our borders are secure, but also that we continue to enjoy the incredible boost that we get from attracting talent from all around the world. Both candidates agree that we should be prudent in terms of how we use our military and that we should care for our veterans when they come home. So if you look at 95% of the issues, there's strong agreement there. You don't see the same kinds of divisions between the two Democratic candidates that remain that you've been seeing in some of the Republican debates. Yeah.
Mr. President, what did Speaker Ryan's comments tell you about the state of the Republican Party, and how would you advise your fellow Democrats who appear to have to now run against Donald Trump as to how they can win in November?
Well, I think you have to ask Speaker Ryan what the implications of his comments are. There is no doubt that there is a debate that's taken place inside the Republican Party about who they are and what they represent. Their standard bearer at the moment is Donald Trump. And I think not just Republican officials, but more importantly, Republican voters are going to have to make a decision as to whether this is the guy who speaks for them and represents their values. I think Republican women, voters, are going to have to decide, is that the guy I feel comfortable with in representing me and what I care about. I think folks who historically have been concerned about making sure that budgets add up and that we are responsible stewards of government finances have to ask, does Mr. Trump's budgets work? Those are going to be questions that Republican voters, more than Republican officials, have to answer. And as far as Democrats, I think we run on what we're for, not just on what we're against. For the last 7.5 years, we've been pretty clear about what we believe will help working families who are struggling out there. And although it has been difficult to get through Republican Congresses to get those things done, the truth is that they continue to be prescriptions that would really help people. You know, making sure that families get paid sick leave and family leave and early childhood education. That would help families. Raising the minimum wage would help a lot of people. Rebuilding infrastructure would put back to work a whole bunch of guys in hard hats and gals in hard hats that need to work. And those are good jobs that can't be exported. Now's the time to do it. So I want Democrats to feel confident about the policy prescriptions we're putting forward. And the contrast, I think, will be pretty clear. I'll leave it up to the Republicans to figure out how they square their circle. All right, I'm going to take 2 more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. President, what's your message to Democratic voters who has yet to cast their vote, who may be hesitant to vote for the Democratic frontrunner because of the ongoing email scandal and investigation? And also, did you see Donald Trump's taco bowl tweet and your thoughts on it?
I have no thoughts on Mr. Trump's tweets. As a general rule, I don't pay attention to Mr. Trump's tweets. And I think that will be true, I think, for the next 6 months. So you can just file that one. In terms of the Democratic vote coming up, I'm going to let the voters cast their ballots and not try to meddle in the few primaries that are remaining. Let the process play itself out. We'll know soon enough. It's not going to be that much longer. David?
I just want to ask you one on infrastructure. Not long before your nuclear summit, where you had 50 world leaders here, the D.C. Metro was closed for over 24 hours. You at the White House Correspondents' Dinner made note that you'll soon be a sort of more ordinary district resident.
Right.
I'm wondering what that says, that the nation's capital, their own metro system, was closed for 24 hours and that it's having a number of safety-related problems. And what can your administration do if Republicans are standing in the way of an infrastructure bill specifically for the D.C. Metro to potentially provide more funding or any more support for such a critical service?
Well, first of all, I know this is a somewhat self-interested question, I assume, because a bunch of folks here take the Metro. But it is just one more example of the underinvestments that have been made. Look, the D.C. Metro historically has been a great strength of this region. But over time, we underinvested in maintenance and repair, and the steps that are being taken now, I'll refer to Department of Transportation, and but I can say that obviously safety comes first, and we want to make sure that if there's safety concerns that that they're addressed. The broader issue, though, is we got bridges, we got roads, we have ports, we have airports, we have water mains and pipes, as we saw in Flint, that suffer from neglect. And in many parts of the country, we're still relying on systems that were built 30, 50, in some cases 100 years ago. And the reason we've been neglecting them is not because we don't know how to fix them. It's not because people haven't been aware of the need. We've known for years now that we're $1 trillion or $2 trillion short in terms of necessary infrastructure repair. I talked about this when I came into office and sought to do more in terms of investing in our nation's infrastructure. The problem we have is that the Republican Congress has been resistant to really taking on this problem in a serious way. And the reason is because of an ideology that says government spending is necessarily bad. And I addressed this when I was in Flint. That mindset, that ideology, has led to us not investing in those things that we have to do together. As you point out, this metropolitan area, the nation's capital, economically is actually doing really well. But it doesn't matter how big your paycheck is if you've been taking the metro and suddenly it's shut down for a month. And now you're stuck in traffic trying to drive to work instead. You can't build your own metro system. You can't build your own highway. You can't build your own airport. And so we have a specific problem with underinvesting in infrastructure. Now's the time, by the way, for us to do so. Interest rates are so low, and there are so many contractors and construction workers that are underemployed at the moment that you can actually get jobs done on time, on schedule. It would give a boost to our overall economy because we know that when we spend $1 in infrastructure, then you actually get a bigger bang for the buck in terms of the economy overall. Surrounding businesses, suppliers, food trucks, everybody does better. And it gives a huge boost to the economy, and it lasts for a long time. Think about the investments we made in things like the Hoover Dam, or the Golden Gate Bridge, or Metro. It's a good thing to do, and it historically was not and should not be partisan. But if we have a mindset that says whatever government's doing must be bad, then these are going to be the results, and it's going to continue to get worse. It's already tough in poorer communities like Flint, but we're seeing these kinds of infrastructure problems spring up in communities all across the country, and it doesn't distinguish by race or by region. Everybody needs roads. Everybody needs airports. So hopefully this will prompt a conversation. Last thing I'm going to say about this is a good example of making sure that the candidates are speaking to this issue as you go into the presidential election. I've put forward very specific proposals for how I would pay for additional infrastructure investment. The numbers add up. And so the question is, how do the remaining candidates for the presidency intend to tackle this? How do members of Congress intend to tackle this? What's the Republican agenda for infrastructure? Do they have one? How do they pay for it? Do they pay for it by cutting Medicare or Medicaid? If they do, that needs to be fleshed out. And the consequences for working families needs to be explained. All right? Thank you, everybody.
Your Howard speech tomorrow, sir, your Howard speech. Interact with, talk about that.
All right. Happy Friday, everybody. I don't have anything in addition to that at the top. I'm happy to take whatever questions remain. Hopefully there aren't many.
Circling back to the campaign, Bernie Sanders is threatening a fourth flight at the Democratic convention. He wants these committees that pick the platform to be made up of proportional numbers based on the results of these primaries. As the head of the Democratic Party, does the president have a view about whether that's a fair model that should be pursued?
Well, Josh, there are rules and regulations that sort of govern the conduct of the convention. And there's a whole apparatus at the Democratic National Committee that can follow the guidelines and ensure that our party hosts a convention that's consistent with the rules, but also reflects the preferences of those who participated in primaries and caucuses across the country. And the president's got a lot of confidence in his DNC chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to navigate this process and ensure that it concludes fairly and reflects the interests of Democrats across the country.
And on that strike that we talked about yesterday in Syria that killed at least 28 people, both Russia and Syria are saying their aircraft were not responsible for this. I know you said yesterday you weren't aware of any U.S. or coalition aircraft in the area. Do you have any more recent intelligence about where that strike came from, who was responsible?
Josh, I can tell you that my colleagues both at the Department of Defense and in the intelligence community are continuing to look at this particular situation. As I noted yesterday, we're not in a position where we can draw clear conclusions about who exactly was responsible for this incident. What is true is that regardless of who was responsible, there is never any justification for carrying out a strike that targets innocent civilians, particularly innocent civilians that have already fled their homes to escape violence. And unfortunately, there is a long track record of the Assad regime doing precisely that. We're going to continue to take a look at this particular incident around Idlib, and it's obviously an incident that we take quite seriously. But we take quite seriously the other incidents that we know have been perpetrated by the Assad regime against innocent civilians. And the bloodshed that we have seen inside Syria is astonishing and tragic. And too much of that blood is the blood of innocent civilians, and it's on the hands of Bashar al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad and members of his government. And that is why we have made a strong case that Bashar al-Assad needs to leave power and make room for the kind of political transition inside of Syria that's long overdue, so that a political leader inside of Syria can assume power and unify that country and bring an end to the chaos and the violence.
On that transition, the administration set this August deadline for a political transition in Syria. What exactly is the U.S. threatening to do if that deadline is not met? And does the White House feel that the president has credibility behind any kind of a threat, given his reluctance to strike a few years ago?
Well, Josh, I'm not aware of any threats that have been issued. I think what Secretary Kerry and others have laid out is a framework for carrying out painstaking political talks. And those political talks have been undermined by the propensity of the Assad regime to carry out attacks against innocent civilians inside of Syria. Opposition leaders are understandably reluctant to come to the table with people who are, at the very same time, authorizing military assaults against their constituents. So, we haven't seen as much progress in these political talks as we would like to see. But the fact that the UN is even able to identify parties to the talks and has, over the last several months, been able to organize proximity talks is an indication that we've made more progress than we have over the last 5 years, but we're still a long way from the kind of political agreement that we need to see.
And President Erdogan is moving very quickly to try and consolidate power after the Prime Minister's resignation. I was curious, how the U.S. feels about, whether you have any concerns about that much power amassing in the Turkish presidency in light of some of your concerns about press freedom and the Kurds and other issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, Josh, obviously, as I mentioned yesterday, the United States and Turkey are NATO allies, and we have worked effectively with the Turks to expedite some elements of our counter-ISIL campaign. For example, Turkey has given the United States and other members of our coalition access to military facilities in Turkey that have made our military campaign even more effective against ISIL. But we've also seen Turkey make some progress in securing their border with Syria that has blunted the flow of weapons and foreign fighters across the border into Syria. Both of those things have been beneficial in our efforts to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL. That has not, however, prevented the United States and even the United States or even the President of the United States from raising concerns about situations in which the Turkish government does not seem sufficiently committed to protecting the basic universal human rights of their people that, by the way, are enshrined in the Turkish constitution. These are rights that the United States advocates for around the world, and we do not hesitate in raising concerns, even when those concerns involve the actions carried out by a government with whom the United States has an important alliance. And that will continue, even as Turkey works through some of this through this political dispute and through this political turmoil. The United States is going to continue to stand by our ally. We're going to continue to work effectively with them to carry out a military campaign against ISIL, and we're not going to hesitate to publicly and privately encourage them to live up to the principles that are enshrined in the Turkish constitution. Okay, Jeff.
Josh, is the White House watching the Congress in North Korea that Kim Jong-un opened today, in which you talked about nuclear successes but also boosting economic development? Do you take that seriously, and what's your reaction?
Well, the administration is obviously aware of developments in North Korea, and we watch them closely to the extent that those kinds of developments occur in public. That makes this situation a little unusual. We obviously are aware of the risk that is posed by North Korea's effort to develop nuclear weapons and systems capable of delivering those nuclear weapons. The United States has worked effectively with the international community to counter those efforts, and as a result, North Korea has faced increasing isolation, which is saying something because they were pretty isolated at the end of last year, and that trajectory has only gotten worse for them. And we know that it's had a negative impact on what is already a rather weak economy. Our efforts have targeted those elements of the North Korean economy that we know benefit North Korea's weapons programs, and our concerns stem from the fact that those programs are inconsistent with their international obligations. And those aren't just concerns that the United States has raised, those are concerns that have also been raised by countries like China and Russia and South Korea and Japan. And the international community is serious about holding North Korea to account for their destabilizing and provocative behavior. And there is a path that North Korea can take to come out of the wilderness, to emerge from isolation. But it will require them renouncing nuclear weapons and demonstrating a clear commitment to ending their provocative actions and denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. Okay. Let's move around a little bit. April.
Josh, I did ask the president about Howard. He chose not to answer.
I noticed. He's going to talk about it tomorrow, though.
Well, wait a minute.
That's the good news, I guess.
You said you were going to give us information today. Are you going to not do it because the president didn't answer?
No, I can try to help give you a sense of what he's thinking.
I'd like to know.
Well, I'll try. I do think I looked this up before I came out here. This is actually the third time that the president's delivered a commencement address at an HBCU since entering the Oval Office. Back in 2010, the president gave the commencement address at Hampton University. And then in 2013, the president delivered the commencement address at Morehouse College in Atlanta. So the president, in delivering the commencement address at Howard, will be delivering the commencement address at the third HBCU since taking office. The president will address a couple of themes. The first, the president will acknowledge the unique opportunity that these graduates have had to attend one of the finest HBCUs in the country. This means that they've been exposed to passionate faculty members and a community of classmates that has nurtured their innate ability and empowered them with skills and experiences that can benefit our country. So this means that Howard students have been given a great gift, but they also are assuming an important responsibility. And I do expect you can that the president will touch on that. The president will also observe that Howard graduates will be entering an economy and a society that's undergoing a series of profound changes. These changes aren't new in the sense that the changes didn't just start, but this is actually the class of 2016 has had a view of these changes throughout their lives. And how they use the skills that they've gotten in the course of this high-quality college education to confront the tremendous demographic, economic, and technological changes that our country is experiencing right now is a question that each of those graduates will have to answer for themselves. The president is hopeful that they'll answer that question in a way that's good for the country and is consistent with the significant responsibility that they now have. Finally, I think the last thing I'd point out is, as somebody who has spent a decent portion of his professional career talking to young people and college graduates, the president enjoys the opportunity to give these kinds of speeches, but also to consider these issues that are on the minds of college graduates across the country. And obviously, the speech that he's delivering tomorrow is an important one and an opportunity that he's looking forward to. But the president will have an opportunity to flesh out some of these themes in commencement addresses that he'll also deliver at Rutgers and the Air Force Academy later this year.
So, were you able to get the information that you were trying to find for me yesterday? You said you would find for me when it comes to this administration and HBCU's funding, support, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got a fact sheet here. Rather than just reading through it, why don't I'll have somebody email it to you when we get done. Well, I think the highlight is that the president's FY 2017 budget seeks to strengthen funding for HBCUs. We've made a lot of progress over the last 7 or 8 years in increasing the support that HBCUs receive, but the president's budget proposes $85 million in mandatory funding for HBCUs. The president also proposes an additional $244 million in discretionary funds for Title III. I think the other thing that I would acknowledge is the president has sought to dramatically expand access to the Pell Grant program for college students across the country. This, of course, does not apply just to African American college students, but it does tangibly enhance the ability of middle-class families and those families that are trying to get to the middle class to send their kids to college. And the president's funding proposal for 2017 reflects continued commitment to that expansion of the Pell Grant program that I think many HBCU students have actually used to afford a high-quality education at Howard University.
So, Let's go to 2016, the monies that were actually realized, the monies that actually passed. What was the money, what was the number for 2016 for this fiscal year that we're still?
I don't have that in front of me, but I can pull it and we can try to get you some additional data. Andrew.
Josh, I don't know if you saw that Hillary Clinton has apparently come out against the possibility of TPP being passed during a lame duck session. I was wondering if you think what you think of that, and whether it makes it look like the president's trade agenda is at risk of unraveling.
Well, Andrew, I'm not particularly surprised by it. Her views on this topic are well known. But it doesn't really change our strategy. The truth is, Secretary Clinton and many other leading candidates for the presidency last year expressed opposition to Trade Promotion Authority legislation. This was ultimately legislation that paved the way for the completion of the TPP negotiations. And in spite of her opposition to that legislation, the administration worked effectively with Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate to pass that bill. The truth is, passing TPA is a bigger challenge than getting Congress to ratify TPP for a couple of reasons. The first is a procedural one, which is that TPA had to overcome a filibuster effort in the United States Senate. TPP only requires 50 votes in the Senate to be ratified by the United States Senate. But the second thing, and in some ways this is more important, TPA was rooted in a philosophical argument about giving the President of the United States the authority to negotiate a trade agreement that's in the best interest of the U.S. economy. That required us essentially to make a strong case that the United States Congress should trust the President to get this done and actually give him the authority necessary to complete the negotiations. Now that we've completed the negotiations, the American people and members of the United States Congress can evaluate the terms of the agreement and judge for themselves about whether or not it's good for the economy. If they're willing to do that, we've got a very strong argument to make. For example, the TPP trade agreement would result in cutting 18,000 taxes that other countries impose on American products. The TPP agreement includes high and enforceable standards when it comes to protecting our environment, protecting human rights, and protecting labor rights. Those are the kinds of values-driven proposals that are included in the TPP agreement. But those don't just reflect our values, they also reflect a commitment on the part of this president to leveling the playing field and giving American businesses and American workers an even better opportunity to compete in a 21st century global economy. And the president's made a strong case as recently as this week in the Washington Post. He wrote an op-ed basically making clear that if the United States refuses to engage in Southeast Asia and produce a set of economic standards, then China will. And when China comes in to write the rules of the road and put in place those standards, they're not going to insist on high environmental standards. They're certainly not going to insist on lofty human rights or labor standards. And that will only further, if they succeed in doing that, that will only further disadvantage U.S. businesses and U.S. workers when they're competing for business in Southeast Asia. This is significant because Southeast Asia is home to some of the most dynamic economies in the world. So from a economic, strategic, and values perspective, we have a very strong argument to make about the wisdom of Congress moving to approve the TPP agreement that the president negotiated.
Another question on trade. The Chinese believe that in 2001 they made an agreement with the US and EU and various other WTO partners to, from December 11th, be treated as if it were a market economy for the purposes of anti-dumping duties. What would China have to do? Well, do you have the same assessment that China, after the 11th of December, must be treated as if it were a market economy? Are you ready to declare them a market economy?
My understanding, Andrew, about this is rudimentary, but my understanding is that those kinds of assessments are actually reached by the Commerce Department. So I'd refer you to them for a sense of our current assessment of China's economy. I'd also refer to them to answer the question about whether or not they're considering changing that assessment.
Okay, sorry, a final question was just to clear up something you said in response to Josh. Secretary Kerry actually said there would be consequences if Russia didn't meet the August deadline, which is enshrined in the Vienna process. But you seem to be saying that even if they keep on breaking the truce, even if there's no prospect of further talks, even if they keep bombing, IDP camps, there's still going to be more talks. That's the only way forward.
Well, I think what Secretary Kerry is pointing out is that Russia and President Putin himself has publicly advocated for a political transition inside of Syria. President Putin himself has acknowledged that this is an important priority. And failing to meet that deadline will have negative consequences for everybody that's involved. We know that we know based on the degree to which Russia has invested in Syria, that they care deeply about the outcome. They have a lot riding on this. Russia maintains a military presence inside of Syria. Syria is the only country outside of the former Soviet bloc where Russia continues to have a military presence. So we know that they're quite protective of it and concerned about what's happening in that country so that they can protect the foothold they have in that country. Failing to succeed in negotiating a political transition is not going to be good for the Russians. It'll have negative consequences for them. I'm not saying the United States benefits from that. It has negative consequences for everybody that's involved there. It certainly has negative consequences for everybody who's concerned about the widespread violence that we've seen there. So I think the point is the international community is focused on meeting this goal. And that is a priority, and it is something that President Putin has demonstrated he's deeply invested in. Look, and to a large extent, he's put his own credibility on the line here. He's made clear that he's prepared to use his influence with the Assad regime to bring about this political transition that benefits Russia, that benefits the Syrian people, that benefits everybody who's involved. So it will be important for Russia to use their influence to try to advance these talks and bring them to a constructive conclusion on the time frame that's been laid out. The United States is certainly prepared to do our part, and it'll be important for Russia to make clear that they expect the Assad regime to do their part as well.
Well, this week you put the onus on Russia on this, but at the end of the day, it's the Syrian regime. Would you rule out any measures against the Syrian regime if they were to stop, if they were to, breeze through this August deadline?
Well, let me take on one part of the early part of your question, which is that when the president was meeting with the GCC countries, he certainly made clear to them that it's helpful for them to use their influence with the opposition groups and other relevant parties to try to bring about this political transition. So it's not just the Russian government that we have been pressing. We've been pressing all of the parties. We've been using our own influence with the opposition groups, but we certainly have encouraged our partners who also have influence with the opposition groups to push in the same direction here. So what was the last part of your question, though? Sorry. I was distracted by the first part there.
Why not address the problem at its root? Why not take action directly against the Syrian regime?
Well, Andrew, because the president's made clear there's not a military solution that can be imposed on the situation in Syria. I know I've said that a lot, and other administration officials have, and it sounds a little cliched at this point, but it is a core principle of our approach to this situation. This should be a lesson that we learned in 2003, that trying to overthrow a dictator in the Middle East has long-term and mostly negative consequences for the United States and our national security, to say nothing of the costs that would be incurred if we were to undertake that kind of action. The president would have to deploy thousands, tens of thousands, if not more than 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground. That would cost a lot of money. That would mean that the United States military would sustain significant casualties. And all of that would be done without a clear exit plan. So we can't lose track of that recent historical context when evaluating our options. The president certainly hasn't, and that's why we have pressed so forcefully and with such tenacity on the successful completion of political talks. And we've got a long way to go, but that continues to be our focus. Okay? Jordan.
Thanks, Josh. The president needled Senator Paul a bit there over his blocking these 8 tax treaties.
Yeah.
And
I think he was pretty gentle when you consider that these are tax treaties that have been waiting for congressional approval for. I wrote this down. I think it's since there's one treaty in particular. I believe it's with Switzerland that's been pending ratification by the United States Senate. I believe since 2011. So this tax treaty that we have with Switzerland since January of 2011 has been awaiting congressional approval. We also have a critically important tax treaty with Luxembourg that's been awaiting congressional approval since 2010. So we're talking about more than 5 years of delay here. The benefit is simply, we know that there are companies that use the Swiss and whatever the adjective of Luxembourg is, their financial systems. We know that there are people who use the financial systems in Switzerland and Luxembourg to evade taxation, and in some cases to even hide their resources because they are the result of criminal actions. So I don't really know exactly what justification Senator Paul would have for not moving forward with these agreements that would allow our law enforcement officials to combat those efforts.
Right, but for the last couple of years, actually, Senator Paul has had concerns that these treaties would infringe on Americans' personal tax data and other personal financial information. So I'm wondering what the White House or the administration has done to assuage those concerns that Senator Paul has.
Yeah. Well, my guess is he's not raising concerns on the part of too many middle-class families that are using the financial system in Luxembourg to hide their assets. So I'm not really sure whose concerns Senator Paul is speaking up for. Maybe he can elaborate on that a little bit. I suspect it's not middle-class families in Kentucky that he has in mind.
And then finally, with this legislation on tax shelters, has anyone from the White House reached out to Congressman Brady on the Ways and Means Committee or Senator Hatch about letting this move forward this year?
Well, I know that there have been conversations with members of Congress on a whole host of issues related to closing financial loopholes that entities use to get around our tax code or to evade sanctions or to store the proceeds of illicit activity. So this is a priority that the president has made here, and we've made a lot of important progress. And you see the administration announcing a couple of actions today that will be effective in bringing greater transparency to our financial system. But well, this is the point. We've already taken some steps here administratively. We've also made clear that there are some things that Congress can and should do. And we are going, we have been in touch with them about those measures, and we're going to continue to encourage them to pursue them. Make sense?
Are you saying,
Okay.
are you saying that additional things that haven't been announced today are going to be announced today also?
No, I'm not suggesting there's more coming today. I'm just suggesting there are some things that we put forward that are both administrative, but we also are in touch with Congress because there are some things they should do as well. Okay, Michelle.
And the ones that were announced today, to what extent did the Panama Papers release play into the timing of this?
Well, the rules that were announced today are actually rules that have taken at least a couple of years to put together. Obviously, the nature of these rules is that they apply to extraordinarily complex financial transactions. So, our experts had to comb through the regulations and ensure that there were no unintended consequences from the rules that are being put in place. So they were quite conscientious about this. But there's no denying that what they will do is bring much needed transparency to our financial system in a way that will allow, or at least make it much harder for people to evade paying their fair share, but also make it harder for criminals and other people to evade U.S. sanctions.
But the timing, you were working on this anyway, and did the Panama Papers speed it up, or did some of this have to do specifically with the Panama Papers?
I'd refer to Treasury in terms of what direct impact any of these rules would have on the Panama Papers, but or on the practices that were exposed by the Panama Papers. What I can tell you is this is something that was in the works long before the Panama Papers was reported.
Okay, and were you saying that you are ruling out any action or any additional military action against Syria or any other action against Russia if the August deadline wasn't met for Syria?
I think the point that I'm making here is that there are negative consequences for everybody if that deadline is not met. And put another way, everybody who's engaged here, with the possible exception of Bashar al-Assad himself, has a vested personal interest in meeting the deadline to bring about a political transition inside of Syria. So this is not a situation where the United States needs to be walking around threatening people. This is not a situation where we, frankly, need to be coercing people. We certainly will encourage them to use the influence that they have to bring about this outcome, but we're not going to be doing that from the standpoint of asking people to do the United States a favor. Everybody involved in this situation has their own vested interest in seeing this deadline met, and we're going to continue to press hard to see that happens.
Yeah, it is a deadline, though, and it kind of gets to the point of, well, what's the point of a deadline if it just kind of keeps going? So you're not ruling...
Yeah, that's August, though. So if we don't meet in August, then we can go down that line of questioning.
Okay, but you're not ruling anything out. Is that accurate?
Well, I certainly am ruling out the kind of military action that would lead one to conclude that there might be some kind of military solution that's available to the United States for solving this problem. There's not, at least not one that's consistent with our national security interests. I guess there is one that would lead us to a years-long commitment to Syria that would put tens of thousands, if not more than 100,000 U.S. service members at risk, and a whole array of consequences that has a negative impact on our national security over the long term.
Okay, and in regards to what the president said today, we've heard him say some of this before, that it's not entertainment, it's not a reality show, although, I mean, a huge number of Americans are very interested in what Donald Trump has to say, whether they agree with him or not. And the president also reiterated that he doesn't think that he'll be president because Americans have good judgment. But given the numbers and given that he is now the Republican nominee, essentially, does that mean that way, way more Americans have bad judgment than the president originally anticipated?
No, I think the president is merely asserting his confidence that the process that we use to choose the president of the United States is often the source of controversy. It's often messy. It's often frustrating. But it's a process that has served our country well. It doesn't mean the president has agreed with the outcome of every election. But there is a rigorous process that gives the American people enormous influence in choosing the future direction of our country. And that's what it means to be a democratic government. It's a process the president is committed to. And the president's got confidence in the ability of American voters to take that process seriously, to educate themselves on the issues, to engage in the debate, and allow all of that to inform the choices they make at the ballot box. Okay, Kenneth.
Josh, we could tell from the president's remarks that he's itching to get out there on the campaign trail. So does the president believe that the House and the Senate even are in play for the Democrats?
Well, yeah, there obviously is an aggressive campaign that will be mounted by individual candidates all across the country, and those will be important contests. And yes, the president is optimistic about Democratic prospects up and down the ballot this year.
On Iran, did the administration have, quote, handpicked Beltway insiders to push the message, to sell the message of the Iran deal to the public? And the characterization that's out there that's been reported that the administration misled the public in a manner as well. How does the administration respond to that characterization that the public was misled in the selling of the Iran deal?
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen anybody produce any evidence to indicate that that's the case. I recognize that there might be some people who are disappointed that they did not succeed in killing the Iran deal, and maybe that's maybe these unfounded claims are the result of sour grapes. The truth is, the administration, at the direction of the president, engaged in an aggressive campaign to make a strong case to the American people that the international agreement to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon strengthened the national security of the United States. We made a strong case that it strengthened the national security of our closest ally in the Middle East, Israel. We made a strong case that killing the deal would actually make another war in the Middle East more likely. So the president made clear, he ran on this back in 2007 and 2008, that the most effective way for the United States to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon was strong, principled diplomacy. And he was right. And he succeeded in carrying that out, despite the entrenched opposition and skepticism that something like this was even possible. So the president's quite proud of our success in completing that agreement because of the positive impact that has had on U.S. national security in the short term and the prospects that it enhances for an improved posture for the United States around the world over the long term.
So Josh, the characterization I'm speaking of came from a profile on your Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes. Did you read that article? I'm sure you had time to digest it. Do you disagree with some of the characterizations that were in that profile?
Well, again, I don't know that he said misleading in there anywhere. It was rather long, so maybe I missed it. But the administration is quite proud of the fact that we made a strong, principled, fact-based case to the American people that the international agreement negotiated by the president's team to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon wasn't just completed, it was effectively implemented in a way that has enhanced the national security of the United States. Now, that's going to be an important part of this president's legacy, and it's a promise he made during the campaign, and it's a promise that he kept as president. Okay. Kevin.
Thanks, Josh. How concerned is the president that the much talked about 67 consecutive months of net job gains might also end on his watch, given the tepid growth in April?
Well, Kevin, we're up to 74 consecutive months,
That's only private
which
sector. 67 overall, 74 is just private sector.
See, and 67 refers to
Total.
So when government loses jobs,
I see. So you're putting the decline in government jobs on the president's tab here, huh?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying,
Okay.
given the 67 months, or if you just want to use the 74 figure, it's fine. That's private
Okay.
sector.
Okay.
How concerned is he?
Well, we do know that the private sector was really important to our to leading our economic recovery, so that's the number that we focused
Question
on.
about that. How concerned is he, given the relatively tepid growth in April, that might also end on his watch?
Well, I think the president feels pretty good about the strong economic growth that we showed in April, and it certainly is consistent with the longer-term trend that we've seen. So the president is pleased about the direction of the U.S. economy. There surely is more that could be done that would ensure that more families across the country are enjoying the benefits of that recovery, and our economy would be even stronger and even more durable than it already is if Congress weren't blocking some common sense proposals that would strengthen our economy further. The president talked a lot about how investing in our infrastructure would be good for our economy both in the short term and the long term, in part because it would create jobs and generate the kind of economic multiplier that would ripple across the economy in a positive way. But what's also true is that there are some headwinds that emanate from overseas that the United States must be prepared to weather. Right now, the U.S. economy is the envy of the world. This is the most durable economy in the world. But there's more that we can do to make it even stronger. And that's why the president believes that Congress should vote to raise the minimum wage. It's why the president believes that Congress should vote to make important investments in our infrastructure. It's why the president believes that Congress should expand funding for job training and other education programs that would ensure the next generation of Americans has the skills and training that they need to continue this economic strength that our country enjoys. We should not take it for granted. And failing to invest in the fundamentals is the surest way to break that streak. And the president's determined to not let that happen.
Just to follow then, you mentioned some of the worldwide or international headwinds. Domestically, our workforce participation rate now is at 62.8%, lowest in decades. What has the president done to stem that tide? We've heard Jason previously suggest that because more Americans are retiring and because we're graying, that number's going to shrink. What's the president doing to combat that?
Well, one thing we could do, well, first of all, that's true. This is a direct function of the longer-term trends in our society, which is that as the baby boomers age, they're going to retire. And that is going to put more strain on our workforce. That's all the more reason that making sure we have an educated workforce, that we are investing in research and development that could boost the environment for businesses that are looking to capitalize on technology and innovation, to bring new ideas and new products to market. The president also made a reference to reforming our legal immigration system. We know that the brightest minds and many of the brightest minds that other countries have to offer are interested in coming to the United States. Why wouldn't we create an opportunity for entrepreneurs and scientists and others who are looking to start a business or grow a business to come to the United States? That would certainly be good for our economy. It would create jobs in our economy by definition, and would continue to nurture the strong business climate that we have here in the United States, where people are given an opportunity to pursue new ideas and get an education that will allow them to succeed. So the president certainly believes that there are a number of things that we could do, and comprehensive immigration reform that enhances our national security but streamlines our legal immigration system is certainly another option.
Lastly, to the best of your knowledge, has anyone on the current White House staff been interviewed in relation to the ongoing investigation into Secretary Clinton's emails, sir?
Kevin, as we've discussed before, I'm not going to talk about ongoing investigations. It's apparent in the newspaper that that some people are willing to do that, but the fact is the people who are leading the investigation are professionals. They're committed to getting this right. They're committed to doing this by the book and making sure that they're not influenced by political considerations, even in the highly charged political environment in an election year. So I'm going to do my best to help them do what they're trying to do by giving them the space that they need to conduct this investigation and in the way that they see fit. That's consistent with where the facts lead them. And then once they have results they're prepared to discuss, we can take a look at it.
Can you confirm that you've been interviewed?
I'm not going to talk about the investigation, but there's no reason to think that I have been. Okay.
Thanks, Josh.
Carol.
You seem to be downplaying the significance of the political shakeup in Turkey, but it's happening at the same time as the political crisis in Iraq And obviously both of these countries are critical to the president's strategy against Islamic State. So how can you not think this is such a big deal or not have a significant impact on the president's strategy, and what is he doing to try to mitigate that?
Well, Carol, at this point, there has been no impact on our coordination and our ability to work with Turkey to advance our campaign against ISIL. We've received extensive cooperation from them in the last 6 or 9 months on a range of issues, and our campaign has benefited from that. Even as we have intensified our cooperation on a set of counter-ISIL issues, we've not refrained from raising our concerns about Turkey's fidelity to their constitution. And we're going to continue to make those concerns known, both in public and in private, when appropriate.
Are there any specific logistical plans in place or any discussions happening around, what to do if this worsens?
There's
in Iraq and Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, they're quite different situations. I mean, there are always people in the United States government who are engaged in contingency planning, so I'm confident that's taking place at some level. But looking at when it comes to the situation in Iraq, we continue to support the efforts of Prime Minister Abadi to try to unify that country, and we believe that's the most effective way for Iraq to confront the threat that they face from ISIL. I think obviously the thing that both of these countries have in common is that they're sovereign countries with sovereign governments, and we respect the sovereignty of our partners in the same way that we expect our partners to respect the sovereignty of the United States as well. But what we can do is we can support these countries as they confront the significant challenges that are having a destabilizing impact on their politics in this region of the world. There's no denying that the instability in Syria, the widespread migration crisis, the violence from ISIL, all of that has had a negative impact on Syria's neighbors. And that certainly doesn't make an effective political resolution in Turkey and Iraq more likely. But I would argue that's actually yet another reason for the United States and the rest of the international community to continue to drive toward political transition inside of Syria. That resolving the political turmoil in Syria will have a dampening effect on the destabilizing impact that Syria has had on its neighbors, including Iraq and Turkey. Okay, Gregory.
Thank you, Josh. I don't want to belabor the point, but I want to give you a chance to go back to the question you were asked yesterday about intelligence briefings for presidential candidates.
Mm-hmm.
You seem to leave us with the impression, intentionally or unintentionally, that you were not willing to give Mr. Trump the same benefit of the doubt as you would Secretary Clinton in his ability to handle classified information responsibly. Was that the impression you meant to give? And also, we heard from the president just this morning about his concern with some of Mr. Trump's rhetoric, that it could threaten war or has the potential of upending our critical relationships with other countries. Given those concerns the president has expressed, should the American people have any concern with this particular presidential candidate receiving our nation's most classified information?
Well, Gregory, the impression that I intended to leave yesterday is that the decision about what material to present to the two presidential candidates who are nominated by the two major political parties will be made by our professionals in the intelligence community. I did offer an opinion about Secretary Clinton that was rooted in her service as Secretary of State in the Obama administration. She is somebody who undeniably served closely with the president with distinction, and she was critical to advancing a number of policy priorities, including the international agreement to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And that required her to handle sensitive information and to use it in the course of her job to advance our nation's interests, and that's what she did. But ultimately, the decision about how and when and where to give the candidates these briefings will be made by professionals in the intelligence community without regard to partisan considerations. In terms of the American people, they'll have to make up their own minds. I think that they can take, that certainly is true when it comes to deciding who to vote for. But in terms of making decisions about providing sensitive information to individual candidates, I think the American people can have confidence in our intelligence professionals to make that decision.
It's our understanding that historically these briefings have always been done as a courtesy by the sitting president. Maybe more than a courtesy, more of a matter of, long-term preservation of our national security. But they are authorized by the sitting president for the candidates for president. There's no law requiring these, and the president could use his discretion to give or not, or to deny these briefings to any presidential candidate. Is that correct?
I'm not sure of the specifics of the law. What I can say is that the Director of National Intelligence has indicated that he's prepared to move forward at an appropriate time, probably after the convention, with giving intelligence briefings to the two major party nominees. Director Clapper has assigned that responsibility to one of the career intelligence professionals in his office, and the President has confidence in those professionals and their ability to determine how and when those briefings should take place.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Lala, I'll give you the last one, then we'll do the week ahead.
A few questions. Has the President invited the Indian Prime Minister to the White House next month? Do you have anything to say?
I don't have an update for you. I know that there's been some discussion about the potential of Prime Minister Modi visiting Washington and visiting the White House. I don't have an update for you on those discussions at this point.
A statement made by the President today on the shell companies opened by foreigners in the U.S. It's several times reported that quite a number of Indians, politicians and businesses have opened their shell companies here in the U.S. Is the U.S. willing to share that information with the Indian government and help repatriate those money back to India?
Well, let me say a couple things about this. The rule that was announced today by the Treasury Department applied to a very specific group of LLCs. And it would have an impact on that specific group. I know that it is not uncommon for the United States to reach transparency agreements with other countries in terms of sharing this information. Those are typically reciprocal agreements. I don't know what kind of agreement is in place to govern the conversations between the United States and India. I'd encourage you to check with my colleagues at the Treasury Department. They could provide some additional information about that.
And finally, administration's decision to sell 8 F-16s to Pakistan. There is a hold in the Congress right now, and the State Department has informed Pakistan that they should muster their national resources to buy, if they want to buy the F-16. Do you think, does the administration think this will have any impact on U.S. relations with Pakistan, and in what way?
Well, what I will just say is something you've heard me say before, which is that the United States has an important counterterrorism and national security relationship with Pakistan. We value the kind of cooperation that we get with Pakistan, and we have found that cooperation beneficial to the national security of both of our countries. And President Obama has obviously worked hard, even in some challenging circumstances, to cultivate an effective working relationship with Pakistan. And we believe that preserving that relationship and nurturing that relationship is beneficial to the national security of the United States, but also the national security of Pakistan. So with that, let me do a week ahead. On Monday, the President will attend meetings here at the White House. On Tuesday, the President will welcome the NCAA champion UConn Huskies women's basketball team to the White House. He will host an event that will honor the team and their 2016 NCAA championship. On Wednesday and Thursday, the President will attend meetings at the White House. On Friday, the President will host the President of Finland and the Prime Ministers of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland at the White House for a U.S. Nordic Leaders Summit. This event follows the convening of Nordic leaders during the President's trip to Sweden in September 2013. This summit will deepen U.S. Nordic cooperation while highlighting America's continued commitment to European security, transatlantic trade, and the promotion of common democratic values. In the evening, Friday evening, the President and First Lady will host the Nordic leaders for a state dinner. On Sunday, not this coming Sunday, but next Sunday, the President will travel to Rutgers University's New Brunswick campus to address the 2016 graduates at Rutgers University's 250th anniversary commencement ceremony. Rutgers University is one of the oldest universities in the country with a long and distinguished history of advancing research and preparing students with the skills they need to succeed in the new economy. Additional details about the President's trip to New Jersey will be available next week. So with that, I hope you guys all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Josh.
And happy Mother's Day to all of your mothers.